Just a couple more announcements before we bring the next talk on. We really want to push for the raffle tickets, so just so you remember, prices are $3 each, 2 for $5, or 5 for $10. And they do have FPOS available if you don't have any cash. If you are not yet registered by email and wish to receive information about future Eucharistic conventions, please give your contact email to the registration desk. And another reminder that Father Paul Glenn from Australia is available all day in the confessional in the chapel. So if you want to go for reconciliation or even spiritual direction, he will be there all day. Father Paul has attended nearly every convention, and he's come all the way from Australia specifically for just to hear confessions and give spiritual direction. So definitely take advantage of that. And finally, the Mother of Divine Mercy group are selling the convention T-shirts for $10. So go and support that. And so for our first session for the morning, I'm going to call back Father Neil Vaney, who will be sharing again on refounding the New Zealand Church in a Marian vision, concluding now with the practical steps. Father Neil Vaney.
Tim was just speaking about remarkable coincidences. About 6 months ago, I was at a course for Catholic young people, Hearts of Flame. And I went to a particular workshop, and it was on Catholic short story writers and novelists. And his name was flagged around, and I thought, that's interesting, I've never met him. Come here, and there he is. This is just how it is. So anyway, I'd better recapitulate briefly about what I said yesterday, so I put it in context. Remember, I started with the fact that in the church at the moment, we seem to be in a pretty dull, difficult time. You know, we've had an awful royal commission in Australia. We've got a cardinal in prison, although he's appealed. And we've got all the issues we're facing in the church, and we're going to have a royal commission here in New Zealand. So it's easy to feel, that the church is in difficulties. But yesterday, we had some really strong words about take courage because all bright things are happening. Not yet, but they will. And we looked at a couple of incidents in history, particularly the 9th and 10th century, when the church and the papacy seemed so low. And then we had a look at the French Revolution. And what we discovered was after both of those terrible, dark, awful times in the church, extraordinary, utterly unpredictable and wonderful things happened. And especially the French Revolution had enormous impact for us in New Zealand. Because what happened was that as a result of that, a whole lot of religious orders were founded, and many of them came to New Zealand. And our faith, as the New Zealand, the Aotearoa Church, was founded on many, many of those congregations. Okay. So basically, we were talking about what did we learn from the French Revolution. And I turned to my own order, the Society of Mary, and we discovered that as a result of the French Revolution, the church was really split badly because there were people who thought you had to go back to the old ways where the king and the nobles and the church all worked together and they had utter control over the land in many ways. Others said, no, we want a constitutional king, a bit like England. And others said, like Lacordaire, he said, no, we want liberty, equality, freedom, but we want spirituality as well. And that really divided the French church for about 100 years. But John Claude Collin, our founder, he said, look at Mary. She was the hidden face behind the burning church in the early days. And what do we learn of her? What was her work? And I looked for that, and we looked, for example, at the 3 things that Colin learnt that the church must avoid. And he said, first of all, power. If you think you can boss people around, if you think you can ignore civil law, that you can hide priests who have abused, that you can conceal what's gone on, you think you're like a prince, you're going to destroy the fabric of the church. What about pride? Do we get up and say, we know everything and you're doomed to hell? That's what many of the preachers who came back were doing. And possessions. How easy it is to want to have affluence, to have everything you need. So we talked about that. We said, how was Mary? And we looked at her, if you'll recall, at Cana and what she did. She watched, she observed, she saw people's real struggles and difficulties, and she turned to Jesus and said, do something about this, son. She's like a good mother. She said, you get onto it and do something. And he did. He did. And what he did, of course, was changed the water, the law of the Old Testament, into the new wine of the Spirit. And that Spirit is going to be how the church will be transformed. And what I want to do this morning is to look at, I think, some real possibilities for us as a church where I think we need to go. So let's have a look at this now. Oh, there we go again. Yeah. Technology is not working. Yes, it is. Okay. Now, one of the things that worries people is we say we live in such a secular age. Nobody listens to God. It's like Tim was saying, everybody are either, agnostics or say science has disproved God. And we think, well, there's nothing out there. But the amazing thing is that there's lots of pointers that God is still working. And one of them I want to talk about because it opened up something really interesting for us is this amazing man. It's really misbehaving a bit today. Might need a bit of help with this. It's really not working. Okay. So this person is called Sir Alister Hardy. And the interesting thing about it was he was a marine biologist. He worked at Oxford University. He was a devout Christian, had been from a young boy, but he was a scientist, and he worked very strictly as a scientist, with all the scientific method that he did. Now, he was enormously respected as a marine biologist, and in fact, some of his work is still used today. But what he came back to was, as a young boy, he had this extraordinary experience in the Fens, East Anglia, in England. And he had this profound, deep spiritual thing, and it never left him. Now, when he retired in the late the 1960s, he thought, I wonder if we did a scientific analysis of what people's experience religiously is, what we'd find. So he got onto this thing. He created a religious research unit, and they worked like any university body, and he got people because he knew them in schools, and he went out to lots and lots of schools, and they interviewed young kids, and they said, look, have you had this sort of experience? And he began to discover that all these schools that went to, some religious schools, comprehensive schools, modern schools, mixed schools, everything, quite a few of the kids said, yeah, we've had something like that, about 30%. What he did then was people said, you need to make your questions a bit sharper. And he did that, and it started coming back to discover that about 50% of the kids had had an experience like this. And he put this all into writing, and some people then picked it up. Now, the interesting thing is that it was then picked up by a man here in New Zealand. He was working again as a film producer and researcher, and his name was Paul Hawker. And what he had done is he had read about basically mystical experience in the Ignatian retreat, which I'm going to talk about later in this particular session. And he thought, this is a way that people experience God. So what he did was he thought, I will do this. And he went up into it's working. Bravo. Praise God. Okay. You'd better say a little prayer. It continues to work. Okay. It's not. Oh, yeah. Now, I don't know if any of you know the Tauruas, but this is, as you can see, it's a very rugged mountain chain, pretty close to where I taught at St. Pat's Silverstream. And we used to take our kids up into the hills there to learn about, for Duke of Edinburgh, outdoor training. It's a very rugged and dangerous place. Well, he thought, I'll go up and do these Ignatian exercises, 28-day retreat there, and I'll see if I have this experience of God. Now, I know now, working as a director, you'd never do that. You'd never go off by yourself with just a book and see what happens. Well, what happened was nothing. It was terrible for the first 3 weeks. It was wet, it was cold, he was hungry, other people kept on coming into the huts and he couldn't pray. And then about the second to last day, he did have this extraordinary, amazing experience where he thought, my God, something has really hit me in my life. And he thought, I'm going to follow this up. So what he did was he got a job in Australia and he started interviewing people about, have they ever had an experience of God? And suddenly he discovered that many more people than people realized actually acknowledged that, yes, they had had something like that. So he moved to Canada and he did a whole lot of research. And then he published his book, which is really interesting. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. This is his book called Secret Affairs of the Soul. And the extraordinary thing about it is that it has all this research. And it's really, really interesting. You can get it off Amazon or from Book Depository if you're interested. Now, the intriguing thing he thought was, if all these people had this experience of God, why don't they go to church? Why aren't they more religious? And he started looking at the reasons. And here's some of the things he discovered. The first thing is lots of people in the secular world couldn't talk about it because they didn't have any words. They'd never experienced anything like this. And they had no church tradition. They didn't know about mystics. They didn't know about it. So they didn't say anything because they couldn't explain it. It was so bizarre, so amazing, so extraordinary. This is the second thing that happened. Because they lived in busy worlds and it was so different, they just didn't think about it and gradually went behind them, okay? And the next thing was some of them did try and explain it to their mates or to their partners, their wives, and they said, what were you on, okay? What have you been drinking? You know, how were you affected? And they thought they were on drugs or something. And so they shut up. Because when your mates ridicule you or your wife ridicules you, you think, oh, I better not say anything. Okay, the next thing. They began to doubt their own experience especially because the media will talk about all sorts of bizarre things and weird things that people are into, but they don't talk about spirituality. They don't talk about that many people experience God, because that's not kosher. You don't want that on TV. We live in a secular world. So because this is so contrary to everything, people just don't talk about it. But the last big thing, and this is so important, is this. They lacked a community which acknowledged that reality. And this is why church and Eucharist and being together is so important for us. Because unless you have somebody you can talk to or reflect on and you can hear their experiences, you can't grow it. You can't let it come to life. You can't realize, I can grow and I can realize this. Now, in the church, we have an amazing experience, tradition of spirituality and prayer. And because, as Tim said, we're all very, very different personalities, there's not just one type of prayer, there's a huge number of types of different prayer. If you're visual and vocal, you can use something like the rosary, okay, or the chaplet. Okay, if you're into, say, very mystical, emotional language, there's a beautiful Franciscan spirituality. If you're a head person, you can use the sort of contemplative frames which come out of the Dominican tradition. And the thing that really touched me, I'm going to talk about in a minute, was the Ignatian tradition and how that has touched so many people through the Ignatian exercises. So we'll just move on a little bit now. Okay. Now, this is the scriptural basis of it. After Jesus had risen and had gone up to heaven, what did the people do? They gathered. When they entered the city, they went to the upper room where they were staying. All of these devoted themselves with one accord to prayer, together with some women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So to realize what has happened and how Jesus has come into our lives, but now he's not physically with us, we actually together as a body have to learn to pray and to share what's happening. Okay. Now, I want to use an example from my own life because it's the most vivid one for me and one I can speak about easily. When I'd been a university chaplain in Christchurch about 5 or 6 years, that was a fabulous experience for me. I worked with young people who were hungry, who were looking for God, who desperately wanted community. They came from all parts of the country, and it was a wonderful time. When I first went there, I thought I'd be asked really difficult theological questions. Most of the students who came to me said, "Why am I so unhappy? Why has my girlfriend thrown me away? Why am I constantly fighting with my parents? Why do I feel it's so hard to believe?" And of course, these were questions I'd been groping with a little bit. So, it was very, very deep and wonderful time for me, and it grew me as a priest. Then, when my time was up, and I knew it was up and it was right, I was asked to go back to boarding school. And I was teaching, 13 and 4th form little grubby boys, smelly and naughty and difficult, and many of them had been sent to boarding school because their parents couldn't cope with them. And I had to cope with them. And I was shy and insecure, and I loved reading and books and learning, and these little kids, they wanted to be anywhere else except in the classroom, and they made that very obvious, and some of them were quite difficult. And I remember one kid used to get on my wick all the time, and he knew how to push my buttons, and I can remember one day I got so enraged, I rushed over to him and put my hands on his throat. Now, I'd probably be in prison today if that happened today. Anyway, I saw the look of stark terror in his eyes, so I pat my hands away. And I thought, "Neil, you're in trouble. You've got to do something about this." So at the end of the year, it was advertised for our religious order there would be a 30-day retreat, okay? Jesuits were coming from Australia with a number of religious sisters. And we went down to Teschmakers. Now, does anybody here know where Teschmakers is? Anybody ever been there? A few people, yeah. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It used to be a school for rural girls mainly, just outside Oamaru. And a lot of girls from farms were there. And I can recall them saying they had a place for the horses. And I said, "Why do they have horses?" And they said, "Well, girls of that age, often horses are their best friends, okay? So they have to bring their horse with them." I thought, well, this is a different world. Anyway, we were there, and I went into it. And I thought the big question I had to bring to ask God was, do I need to ask my superiors to take me away from teaching and do something else? Now, when you get into a 30-day retreat, one of the things you do is you take scenes from the scriptures mainly, and you imagine that you are there. And when you're there for 30 days and you don't talk to anybody except your director, you don't see any newspapers, you don't see any television, and you've got nothing to do, your imagination just blossoms. I thought I had no imagination at all. Well, the thing is, you get into these extraordinary things, and you put yourselves in these scenes in the gospel. And I suddenly realized this was so powerful. And what began to emerge for me was that I was reflecting and meditating about Jesus as a young boy and his growing up and the incidents that happened to him. And what began to come back to me was a lot of stuff from my own childhood. And I began to realize for the first time that my family situation was very different. That I was number 6 in a family of 8. I had 4 teenage sisters who were all older than me. My mother was trying to cope with them and all their flights of fancy of teenage girls and all the naughty things they were doing. And my dad was working for the army. He was away quite a lot, and he was battling a bit with alcoholism at the time. So I grew up as a very lonely, insecure little boy, craving for love. And the way I looked for it was being little daddy two-shoes, absolutely perfect. So I worked like like hell, okay? And I studied and I tried to impress everybody. And although I was tiny and very, very small, if I played sport, I would act like a cannonball, a human cannonball. I'd put myself on the line because I was trying to get attention and get love. Anyway, I spoke to my director about this, and he said, look, what I might suggest is this. What you might do is you might imagine that you are in the workshop of Mary and Jesus and Joseph, and he's making various things, and you're sitting on the floor playing with Jesus as a little boy, and every so often he picks you up and holds you in his lap and gives you a cuddle. And I did this, and I felt inside me all sorts of things beginning to move. And one day I was walking outside, and I could go back to Teshmakers now and show you the very, very spot where this happened. It suddenly occurred to me that the model that I used in my imagination for St. Joseph was somebody out of my past life. And I suddenly realized it was a Morris brother who taught me when I was in Standard 5 and Standard 6. And he was a very good teacher. He encouraged me with language. He taught me to read books. He encouraged me to play sport. He was like really an absent father for me. And I realized then as an adult that he loved me in a good, positive way, and I loved him. But what happened on the last day of class was that we were all being a bit silly, and I did something very minor. I can't remember what it was, but it was a tough school with tough kids, and so everybody who marched to the front, I got caned on the hand, okay? Now, being caned on the hand is not much fun, but it's not terrible. But as I walked back to my class, what I said to myself as I went back to my seat was, you can't trust anybody. I can say that after 30 years, I still feel that emotion. It's still so strong. Now, when that happened, suddenly it was as if this amazing windows opened and light flooded in, and suddenly I understood instantly so much about my life. I saw why I was so fearful and distrustful of older colleagues. I saw why I was so shy. I saw why I found it so hard to express my emotions honestly. And from that moment on, I realized what I had to do with my life. Then, through the help of spiritual directors, and I did a bit of psychoanalysis at one stage, all of this I came to terms with. It wasn't instant. It took quite a while. And over time, what happened was my understanding of my parents and who they were grew. So what I could tell you at the moment is that I probably feel, my parents both died 30 years ago, closer to them, more loving, more understanding, and more full of joy about them than I ever have been in my whole life, than ever was. And the amazing thing is I'm looking so much forward to meeting them in heaven, because we've got so much to catch up on I never knew as a kid. I never experienced. I know that are going to be wonderful. Okay, now why I tell you that story, and we'd better move on now, is that what it points out to me is all of us need to be in a nest of prayer. See, the problem is we live in a world which is very individualistic, and it basically says to us, you make it, you make your world, you make your decisions, it's all up to you. Now that's not the reality at all. See, the reality is that we live in worlds in which the interactions, the relationships, the values we have are sustained by the people that we love. And if we are alone, that won't happen. Now, one of the things that both Hawker and Alistair Hardy discovered was that there's two things that bring people to a knowledge of God. The first one is pain and dislocation, the sort of thing I've been describing, and Tim was talking about when he was in New York. The second thing that brings people to God is the experience of the beauty of God, the stunning beauty. And that's the other thing I want to talk about. And that's why I've put, if we just go back one, okay, why I've put this one up. When I was a university chaplain, one of the things we used to do was take students tramping down in Fiordland. And I think I may even have walked along that particular track. Now, one of the things that I remember, I was a chaplain to the Catholic Tramping Club, and I used to take a mass kit, and we used to say mass there in the bush. And two incidents I just remember very particularly because they were so powerful and so beautiful. The first time I did the root burn track, we were going to go up what's called the North Root Burn, which is much more rugged, and you have to climb over through quite snowy fields to get to the top. And the first day we came along a track just like that, and we moved into this basin, and we climbed up a bit, and although it was summer, there was still snow all around. It was late evening, or it was summertime, of course. We decided we'd have Mass. So what we did was we built an altar basically just out of the packs of the trampers, and I said Mass there. And I was looking out, and all around me were these incredible snow-capped peaks, and the sun was just going down. And the beauty and the peace of that place was absolutely, utterly stunning. I'll never forget it, never forget it. A few days later, we climbed to the top, and we were right on the tops, and we were actually above the bush line and above the snow line, and next to this little tarn, this little lake, and there were little icebergs floating in it, and there was, it was the colour of sort of blue steel, and there was this enormous great rock there with a sort of a basin cave underneath it, and I said Mass there, and a whole lot of keas, the beautiful keas were there, and they were sitting, about 30 of them, on the top of this rock, and I thought they were like angels. And I remember how particularly stunning, beautiful that was. That's the other thing that brings people to God. It's beauty, and it's so important. So let's just move on, and we'll have a look at this. Now, this is what Pope Francis talked about in his Care for Our Common Home, Laudato Si'. What he pointed out was the environment is just not a matter of physical earth. That's very important, because if we don't look after that, we're going to destroy our planet and we're going to destroy our lives. But what he pointed out was that our planet, it's being embodied, it's a theology of the body, is a revelation of God. That the beauty of God shines out through the beauty of the planet. Where do we see this? Where should we see this? In the Eucharist. Because what is the Eucharist except taking the fruits of the earth? The grain, which is milled and worked by people, made by people into bread. The wine, which comes out of a whole process of, grapes and distillation and tasting and things like that. So the bread and wine is a symbol of the gifts that God has given us. And it's transformed into the body of Jesus. And when we receive the body and blood of Jesus in the Eucharist, we are transformed, and we are a message between earth and heaven. We are the mediators between the earth and God. And in fact, we're all held in that. We're all in a relationship. Now, the big thing about our faith and the way we have to share it is to realize that relationship is one of the critical things in our society which is being eroded, it's being destroyed, and it's being undermined. Okay, so let's just move on to this now. I want to talk about the reality of our society, and I'm very aware of this because I work a lot with young people. That is a brilliant picture because to me it depicts one of the extraordinary things that's happening to many people in our land, and that's isolation and loneliness. Let's have a look at some of these figures. God is the one who creates community. Our society at the moment is destroying community. How? Okay. Here are some of the figures I just want to talk about. The Ministry of Social Development has done a lot of surveys over the last few years. They did one with young people from 15 to 24 about loneliness, and this is what they found. 2% of the people said, I'm lonely, desperately lonely all the time. 4 said, yeah, quite a lot of the time I'm lonely, some a little, and others sometimes. So that's 36% of young people. 1/3 of all our young people say, I'm lonely at times, and sometimes I'm very lonely. Okay, let's move on. Now, some indicators of this. Now, here are some things which are really interesting. The first one I took from a British newspaper because it stunned me. Researchers offer several reasons for the increasing probability of social isolation and chronic loneliness. More than ever are living alone, with 1/3 of all UK households occupied by only one person. They also point to the increasing divorce rate and declining role of the church, all leading to a more fragmented society. Okay. In New Zealand, it's 12% and it's going up steadily all the time. Now, how's that reflected? Well, some of you might have heard the other day our suicide figures, which have just come out for 2016. Something like about 650 suicides, I think. It keeps on rising every single year, and the biggest group are young men between 15 and 24. And anybody here who's connected with a school counsellor, or school students know this. This gets into a school, it becomes endemic, it's terrible. Okay, let's just move on a bit more. Now, one of the big things you will know is that lots of young people, because of this loneliness, get addicted to their screens. Social media is such a powerful medium, and it's very important. It really is a wonderful creation, but like all technology, it has a dark side. And I just want to talk a bit about that dark side, because we have to realize this is one of the problems in the church. People are communicating and trying to form community in different ways, and we have to respond to that. So let's just have a look at the next bit. This is a book by a famous American researcher called Sherry Turkle. The first book she put out was called Alone Together, which I think is a brilliant name for a book. Now, she's been researching for about 30 years about social media and the impact of it. She's a professor at, I think, Princeton or Harvard. She's acknowledged as one of the great experts in the field. This book, when I read it, sort of rocked the socks off me, because it has a lot of research about marriages, about businesses, and about young people and the impact of social communications on them. I'm not going to talk too much about it. You can follow it up, you can read the reviews, you can get it up online. However, I do remember a few things. One of the things she said, for example, was that I think she said 85 to 90% of young people that she had talked to, when they go to bed at night, their phone is right next to their bed or under the pillow, and quite frequently they will talk to friends, okay, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and because they're terrified that they might miss a message. She said most young people in these categories during the day, even when they're at school, they will probably send about 90 texts a day, and they found some young people who were sending over 900 texts every day from their phone. Okay. Now, a lot of it was because they had this desperate need to be connected, to feel they were part of something. And of course, the terrible thing about it is it's a false intimacy. One of the terrible things about it, of course, is that desperate need for intimacy leads to particularly sexting, okay, where young people are sending very explicit sexual pictures because of this need for bonding. But the trouble is, of course, they're not real images. Most of them are created by expectation and need and hurt, and the reality is that people are not relating face to face. And this is one of the things that Turkle says. She says that it's the problem that we create expectations which the medium cannot meet. One of our young guys, Mark Wall, one of the things he does with our leaders in our Maris school, he takes them away on a leadership course for about a week. And they usually go to isolated places like Ruatoria or Lake Wairikari Moana, and they often work with disadvantaged people who are struggling in those areas. And when he gets there for a week, one of the first things he does, he brings out a box and he says, I want you all to put your cell phones in that. Some of them sort of start going, I'm being separated, I can't do this. Well, he insists and they do that. And so for a week, they are interacting with the local people, they're praying, reflecting, they are bonding. And he says that almost always at the end of the week, they say, this was amazing. I didn't miss my phone. I worked with these people, and I got to know these guys I'm working with and these girls I'm working with. And some of them, that has been such a powerful experience. They went back to university or whatever, their whole life changed. Many of them went on to youth leadership in the church. They did all sorts of things because they were able to experience a reality that wasn't images. It was reality. Okay, let's just move on then. Now, what I want to say is, because we are besieged and constantly overwhelmed by the experience of this hectic world and the way people communicate without even realizing it, whereas our parishes should be dynamos, places of prayer, spirituality, and community, they're often actually eviscerated. They lose all their power and impact. Let's just talk a little bit about this. Okay, now many Catholics still are under the impression that on Mass, you go to Mass on Sunday because it's the law of the Church, okay? If I didn't go, I might go to hell. And I've always been doing this, and it's good for my kids and all that. But the big thing we know now is that that's not enough. The Eucharist, it's a thing that Father Tom talked about the other day. It's not primarily a thing, okay? It's embodied in the species, in the tabernacle, but it is mainly the creation of all of us praising God through Jesus in our midst. Now, we can't do that as a people if we aren't a people. If people just walk in and out of church on a Sunday and hardly know each other, that's not going to create a transforming community. It's going to create perhaps some people who are finding spiritual nourishment for themselves, but it's not transforming them. It's not transforming the places they live in. It's not transforming their work. Okay, next point. Now, I want to move on and to look at how Mary, something experienced here. We'll look at the text of the visitation. Thanks, Mark. Now, this picture is an interesting one. Of course, probably some medieval artist's impression. Houses in Palestine never looked like that. But why I like this picture, it's about the older woman who's suddenly pregnant, thinking she never would be, and this young woman who's suddenly got this extraordinary mystery happening in her body, and yet she can't really explain it to anybody, even Joseph. And all the people, of course, in the village, if you know about small villages, those of you who lived in small communities, the tongues would be wagging, and they say, "Have you seen that Mary girl? I think she's showing a bit. Do you think who's she been with, you know?" And for the older woman, of course, they would have been saying, now there's something very funny about this. She's with this old man for a long time, and there's nothing happening there, I can assure you. And suddenly she's pregnant. What do you think is happening? What do you think is happening? And the dad won't talk about it. He's utterly mute. Something funny is going on. Okay, let's think about this now. One of the big things is that the women of the Old Testament, apart from extraordinary women like Sarah and Rebecca and those sorts of people, are usually not named. In these societies, as you know, women had a very crucial role in families and in life, but they weren't public figures and they weren't significant normally. Now, the big thing about them is we know about Elizabeth, we know about Mary, and what extraordinary people they were, mainly because of their sons. And the big thing was both of them knew their sons' names and their destiny before they were born. So, of course, John means beloved of God. Yeshua, or Jesus, means God saves us. Now, because of those names, these two women, their whole lives were transformed because of they formed their children to be like that. John was formed to bring the love of God to Israel. Jesus was formed to be the one who would transform everything by his death. And so it's utterly critical that naming people is significant. Now, that's why it's so important in our communities that we create relationships where people are known, they are respected, they are accepted as they are in terms of their names. Okay, let's just move on a little bit. Speaking face to face. Now, I know that the government and various local bodies are working very hard to try and improve the reality of New Zealand life, but we also know the statistics are awful. We know that child molestation, but particularly physical abuse of children, is very high in our land. We know that 1 child in every 5 in our land is living in sub-poverty conditions. In other words, either their medicine, their food, or their social environment is actually under the minimum level, which is sort of detected and put up there internationally. So, we've got a lot to really work on. But the big thing is the government can try and have policies, but people are only changed by love. And so many people who struggle have a deformed sense of their own possibilities because they've lived with poverty or joblessness or hopelessness for many years. And so how can they give this to their children? Because they don't have it. So to break this cycle, they have to find people who will say to them, what is your name? What do you do? Tell me about your background. How do you feel? How do you got there? Only individuals can do this for individuals. It can't be done simply by social policies. Social policies can set parameters and point out things, but only loving people can transform and make others loving people. Okay, let's move on. Now, one of the things which we're really challenged with is creating a more equal and caring society in New Zealand. One of the statistics which I think is quite awful is that in New Zealand, the last time I looked at the statistics, 10% of the population in New Zealand own 50% of all the resources and wealth in New Zealand. So that's 5%. And 10%, I think, own 90% of all the wealth and resources in New Zealand. Now, there'll always be graduations in society. You can't make everybody the same. That's not true. And they're very, very generous rich people. I know all that. But there's been a lot of research to show that the more unequal a society is, the greater the problems. So I'll just show you something very interesting. See, one of our problems is that I think it would have been Father Roger mentioned this the other day. Everybody has a religious belief. They may not call it that, but it's some ethic, it's some value, it's some belief that sustains them as the most important thing in their life. Now, for us, for many of us in New Zealand, it's the materialist idea. It's this idea which is propagated everywhere, that the more you've got, the happier you're going to be. That you can measure the success by how nice my car or my family or my home is, and I want to live in the right place, and I want to go to the right schools and all that. And this permeates the whole of our society. It has drastic effects. Okay. All right. I consume, therefore I am. Okay, isn't that an epitome of so much of our society? And those of you who know a bit of philosophy, it's a takeoff at the great Christian philosopher Descartes, 15th century, who said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, today that's basically I buy, I shop. You hear about retail therapy. Well, if you've got to buy things to make yourself whole, well, there's something wrong in your life, okay? So it's this whole idea consuming is going to make me happier. Now, there's a very interesting graph. I didn't put it up because it's a bit technical, but it's based on a huge heap of research. And what it shows is that in any community and families, you do need a certain income to avoid poverty, and you need to be able to have enough to give your children things they need, education and health and things like that. And there's a certain income we need, and that's flexible, like over a year, in most families it might differ by $10,000 or something. But what they discovered is after that point, happiness actually goes down. So once you reach a certain point of getting money, it begins to recede. And why does it do that? Because of anxiety, because of people pushing themselves, because of the need to take shortcuts, because of all sorts of things. And so what we know in our society is that many people whose lives are ruined, who commit suicide, are actually people who are very wealthy, who seem to have had very successful lives, because they are spiritually very, very impoverished. Okay, let's just move on. There's an amazing book called The Inner Level by a sociologist, epidemiologist. They did about 5 years of research, and they looked at all the statistics about health, about bankruptcies, about firms and how they do, about wage levels and things like this. And this is the conclusion they came to. I'll just show it to you very, very briefly. The more unequal a society is, the more divided, violent, addicted, and unhappy it is. And their research is so absolutely positive, and everything is detailed. It hasn't been challenged. People just say, well, if we want to have a wealthy society that generate lots of wealth, this is the cost we have to bear. Now, would Jesus live with that? Would the early church have lived with that? They didn't. Those who were in need were helped. So to change society we can't do it easily, and it took hundreds of years before the evil of slavery became obvious. But the big thing is, we have to know this and we have to act against it. In other words, we can't allow ourselves to be taken over by the dominant economic myths of our reality. We have to be countercultural. It doesn't have to mean we have to live like tramps or whatever, but it means we have to know that the cost of the society that we live in and the myths we live in is loneliness, depression, loss of spiritual vision. How can we create spiritual vision? Well, these are the 3 points I want to finish with. First of all, it has to be built on prayer. You can only have the inner strength to be yourself, to be happy with yourself, and to have healed the things that happened to you as a kid when you work in prayer. That's the experience I have. I work with lots of young people through spiritual direction, and I know that this search has to be central. So the first thing I would say to you all is to ask yourself, what is my prayer life like? Am I really sharing with people? Is the Eucharist, is my prayer something that is really critical in my life? Am I joined in some ways to other groups? So, for example, in parishes, what's the life of my parish life? Are there prayer groups? Are there reflection groups? How many people in my parish, in my group, offer spiritual direction? How many people are doing spiritual direction? How many people are doing some training? See, one of the big things which is incredible is we talk in our society about how important it is to keep on doing, training after you leave school and doing refreshing courses, and every business is always tooling up, banging out things. Now, you think about it. So many people think by the time they've done some very basic catechism, by the time they leave school, that they know what needs to be known about God and theology. That's crazy. The trip into God is the longest trip we ever make in our life, and it's the deepest and most profound. And we can only enter that by entering into prayer, and we need to do that with other people. Now, how can we rejuvenate our parishes? Well, one of the things that very impressed me when I was in Chicago, I remember going to an inner city parish there. The liturgy was dynamic, the preaching was terrific, the singing was fabulous. And I looked there, they had about 35 different groups going in that parish. Mothers groups, kids groups, youth groups, music groups, reading books groups. And the life of the place was vibrant. And I said to someone, this is amazing. And they said, 10 years ago, this was a dead inner city parish. They brought in some guys with a bit of vision. They encouraged the local people. They found out what their needs were, and they encouraged them to meet them. Now, the big thing is often in our parishes we say they're dead, there's no young people there. Well, what are you doing about it? Are you talking to any young people and inviting them? Are you saying to people, let's make a prayer group? Let's meet in people's house and talk about some of these realities. What are we doing to transform the face of our church and ourselves? And this devolves on each single one of us, okay? And all it requires is a couple of people. See, if you look, say, for example, at my own society, the Society of Mary, they started with 15 young guys in the seminary who were going to dedicate themselves to this. Only 3 of them stuck at it. And out of that, the whole of the Society of Mary and all that grew. St. Ignatius, the founder of the spiritual exercises, he had a group of about 5 or 6 in Parish University, and the Jesuits started from that. Most great movements in the church start from 3 or 4 committed, dedicated people together. And that's so important for us to realize, okay? It may be slow and gradual. God takes time, okay? And part of our problem today is that we are instant people. If it doesn't happen overnight, we give up, okay? One of the big things I learned is that God has God's own time. and that I wasn't ready to do the 30-day retreat until I'd passed through a bit of suffering and had some good experience in my 30s. It was mainly in my 40s that a lot of that developed in me, and it's been in the last 10 years, I think, that I've had this tremendous sense of giving this to other people. It is a thing that God will do over all our lives, okay? But the other thing is God's grace is wild and unpredictable. So it's amazing. If you look at many of these religious orders and things which have come up, they've just come out of nowhere, okay? But it begins with face-to-face, small personal steps. So you can't change poverty in New Zealand, but in your street or walking to work, there's probably somebody that's sitting there, nowhere to live, something like that. What's your name? How did you get in this situation? Just knowing someone's name. It begins with those steps, because there's where Christ is, okay? That's what we have to reach out to. So let's just summarize it all. This is the 3 pillars of refounding our society, our church. Number 1, prayer. We have to be people of prayer. If we aren't praying, and if we aren't praying in groups, it won't happen. Second one, community. We must create real communities. It's no use being isolated little groups. We have to create dynamic, loving communities. And the last one, we have to care for those who are marginalised. These are the 3 things that transformed the early church and made it so dynamic. They went through great struggles, they went through great persecution, but they transformed the world. There's no reason we can't do the same. It'll be a hard battle, but with the Lord with us, who knows where it'll go. Okay, God bless you, and I hope it works. Okay, God bless you. Just a little plug for my own business. I work in the Catholic Inquiry Centre, and one of the things we do is we have people coming all the time to us saying, I'd like to be a Catholic. And they've discovered that because they've known some Catholic, or they've read something or something like that. And so if you want to help, if you talk to Melly down the back there, who's there for the Catholic Inquiry Centre, there's lots and lots of things you can do to help us spread the word. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Father Neil, for that wonderful session. I think we have taken a lot, and it's really set us on fire to I guess take action, to take those small steps to really refounding the Church of New Zealand and changing New Zealand for the better. So thank you again, Father Neil.